Hello, everyone. So if you missed my class this week, if you simply want a refresher about the structure and function of the heart, or if you're coming to us from the far-flung reaches of the internet, welcome. This is going to be a quick tutorial about the structure of the heart. You see that I've taken the liberty of labeling all of the major structures that we're going to encounter as blood travels through the heart. And, of course, the best way to sort of explore the heart is to trace the path of blood through it. We'll see that deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood never mix in our four-chambered heart. That's an adaptation that not all organisms have. And that the structures of the heart are adapted very well to their function. So, before we get into the path of blood through the heart, I wanted to kind of walk you through the general structure of the heart. And we saw this a bit in our dissection if you did get to dissect last week. But since we did that fairly quickly without a lot of context, I figured I would provide it here. So the heart consists of four chambers. We see the right and left atrium. Remember that the right side of the heart is going to be on your left. And these atria, that is the plural, have very thin walls, as you can see right here. And those thin walls consist of myocardium, or cardiac muscle. In fact, all of the darker areas you see on this diagram consist of myocardium. Those form the walls of each of the chambers, and obviously the thicker that layer of myocardium, the thicker the muscle, the more pressure that chamber is going to be able to generate. You can see that the myocardium in the left and right atrium are fairly thin. So we're not going to be able to generate a lot of pressure there, but we don't really need to because we have oxygen working in our favor here. So with the help of oxygen, the right and left atrium drain blood down into the right and left ventricle. And we notice that the ventricles are a bit larger. The right ventricle seems to be the largest in area, and the left ventricle has the thickest and most muscular walls. That is because ultimately the left ventricle, as we'll find out in a bit, pumps blood through the aorta to the rest of the body after it has received oxygen. And so I wanted to start our journey of blood through the heart on the right side of the heart, because the right side of the heart exclusively contains deoxygenated blood. This is blood that has been around the body to various cells and tissues and has given up its oxygen to those tissues and collected carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. And so both of those gases are going to be dealt with in the lungs in a few moments. But before we do that, we need to run that blood through the right side of the heart. So all the blood from outside the heart is going to come into the atrium first. And if we're talking about deoxygenated blood from all over the body, it's going to come into the right atrium. And it comes into the right atrium from two different places. If we're draining deoxygenated blood from above the heart, it's going to enter through the superior vena cava, which is structure number 2 on your diagram here. And if it comes in from below the heart, it's going to come in through the inferior vena cava down below, which is structure number 8 down on the bottom left. So all of this blood empties into the right atrium. And again, the atria do contract. They actually contract at the same time. The cardiac muscle, myocardium, is the only muscle in the body that can generate its own nerve impulses, and it does so in a rhythmic fashion 60 to 80 times a minute for one's entire lifetime, as long as everything's functioning properly. Really pretty fascinating stuff when you think about it. So, blood comes into the right atrium and exerts some pressure on the valve below. Now, the valve on the right side of the heart is called the tricuspid valve, and it is called that because it contains 3 cusps, or leaflets, basically thin flaps of tissue that open in response to increased pressure of blood in the atrium. And you may remember that that blood pressure is caused simply by the fluid pushing against the walls of the chamber. So when that pressure is exerted on the valve opens, and allows blood to drain down into the ventricle. As soon as the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the atrium, that valve closes. And it doesn't just close weakly. It actually is held back and prevented from flapping back up into the atrium by these little strings of connective tissue called chordae tendineae. You may remember seeing those during the dissection, and the chordae tendineae hold the valve shut when the ventricles contract. And so we're about ready to make that happen. And so the blood is now in the right ventricle, and it's flowed through the tricuspid valve, and it is about to be pushed out. And it's pushed out during a phase of the cardiac cycle called ventricular systole. You may remember seeing something about systolic blood pressure in our brief study of blood pressure, and systolic blood pressure is the higher of the two values. So if your blood pressure is 120/80, for example, that would be the 120. And that blood pressure corresponds to ventricular systole, which is the contraction phase of the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract with their very thick muscular walls, they generate a high amount of pressure, and they push blood out of the heart. So since we're still on the right, that blood goes through the pulmonary valve and up into the pulmonary trunk, which is the base of this blood vessel here. And that pulmonary trunk branches out into two pulmonary arteries. Now, you can see the right pulmonary artery on the left side of your diagram, number 3, goes out to the right lung. And the left pulmonary artery, number 9 on our diagram here, goes out to the left lung. And when the blood gets out to the lungs, there are very thin membranes, both in the blood vessels, they thin out to form capillaries, and in the air sacs of the lungs called alveoli that allow oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream, where it can bind with hemoglobin on red blood cells, and it allows carbon dioxide that has been stored up in the blood to be excreted by the lungs when you exhale. So now the blood has received oxygen, and we need to get it back into the left side of the heart so it can be pumped out to the rest of the body. Now, we've used blue up until this point, and deoxygenated blood is not really blue. It appears blue under the surface of your skin because of skin pigmentation, but in reality, it's a fairly deep red. And when it gets oxygen, it's actually a much brighter red. Something close to the color that I'm using on this diagram. And so that oxygenated blood, which is now something that we really very badly want to get out to the body, comes back into the heart through the left pulmonary veins. There are 2 of them on the left here, and 2 pulmonary veins on the right. And so now we want to get that oxygenated blood out to the body, and the first thing that's going to happen is the blood is going to drain into the left atrium. Remember, when blood comes from outside the heart, it always enters the atrium first. And that left atrium is going to drain its blood with a small, weak contraction down through the mitral or bicuspid valve. And as you might imagine, that valve only has 2 flaps of tissue that open and close in response to pressure. And now we're in the left ventricle. Now you can see that the left ventricle has very thick muscular walls. And this kind of makes logical sense because we have to be able to pump blood out to the entire body starting in the heart. And that's exactly what happens here. During ventricular systole, that contraction phase of the heart, we pump that blood with high pressure through the aortic valve, which you see here, and out the largest and thickest blood vessel in the entire body, called the aorta. Now, the aorta, as you can see, branches out on top here, and these large arteries, branches of the aorta, will supply the brain and some of the organs superior to the heart with blood and oxygen. And There is also a descending branch of the aorta, which you see on the bottom right of your diagram, that brings blood to parts that are below the heart. And this cycle repeats, again, 60 to 80 times a minute for your entire lifetime. And as long as the organs involved are functioning well, this is a very efficient process that gets as much oxygen as you need to tissues for an entire lifetime. So, I hope that that's helpful. If you have any questions, you know where to find me if you're in my classes. If you're not, feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.